Hi, everyone. Tonight I'm going to talk about the Presidential Records Act, or the PRA, and the challenges of keeping records and archives in the age of social media. I'm going to spend quite a bit of time talking about Twitter and the impact of the Trump administration's use of Twitter on the Presidential Records Act. But before we get too deep into that, I wanted to go over the Presidential Records Act and what it requires and what the purpose of the act is. To do that, I need to spend a little bit of time walking you through the history of how that act has changed over time. To begin, I need to speak about two major events that happened in the 1970s that may have led to the creation of the Presidential Records Act. They certainly influenced its need. The first of which was in 1974. Congress introduced and passed, and Ford signed into law, the Presidential Recordings and Materials Preservation Act. This was specifically to address all of the materials, recordings, everything that came out of the Watergate scandal and the Nixon administration, and prepare them for public access, to get them ready to be combed through, so that we could learn about all the things we needed to know about that. It passed and it was signed into law. It was later challenged in the Supreme Court in 1977, but it was upheld. We also need to know about Helen Gandy. Helen Gandy was the secretary for Herbert Hoover, of course not in the 1970s, but Herbert Hoover's administration, both when he was president of the United States and previously when he was the head of the FBI. In 1975, there was a committee hearing specifically investigating the idea that the FBI was harassing public figures, especially ones like Martin Luther King Jr. And Helen Gandy was brought before the committee to testify about the destruction of what she described as personal records of Herbert Hoover immediately after his death in 1972. It took her weeks to destroy these records, thousands upon thousands of documents. If you're interested, take a look at this. This is a really neat story. She, even during the committee hearing, despite the fact that she continued to call them personal records, she admitted that they had historical value to the Hoover administration and to the history of that president. Yet they were still destroyed. There was nothing to stop her from doing so. She didn't do anything illegal. She was following the wishes of Herbert Hoover. So those are two things that probably brought us toward the Presidential Records Act. Of course, there were other concerns at the time. But let's go over what the Presidential Records Act is. So the first thing that it changed is the idea that a president's records are private, that they would be a private citizen making their own records. That changed with the PRA. It also created a structure, and it was the administration's responsibility to maintain those records. A lot of people mistakenly believe that the National Archives are responsible for that. They are after the fact, but storing, organizing, and collecting those records for the PRA is the responsibility of the president's administration. The PRA does allow destruction of records after the AODIS, which is the archivist of the United States, has given a written view on the items that are going to be destroyed. It specifically requires that presidential and personal records are separated and kept separate and organized in a specific way so that those things can be organized. And it establishes a number of protocols so that the public can access these things in the future. So this was a while after the Freedom of Information Act had been enacted, and it required that items were not publicly available until 5 years after administration had ended. However, of course, there are always little catches. There are a number of ways that a president can invoke restrictions that can lengthen that period, but there is a cap, 12 years at maximum. And there are also procedures in place that allow Congress, courts, future administrations, folks who need to investigate something or need it for the work that they're already doing, to view it in a non-public way as part of government access. And later on, it was added that the vice president must follow the Presidential Records Act as well. So, of course, things can change. In 1989, President Reagan issued Executive Order 12667. All this did was add the idea that there could be a 30-day period before things were to be released to the public where the president could make a claim of executive privilege, specifically to AOTUS. Otherwise, information would be released accordingly. 12 years later, and you'll remember that I mentioned 12 years before, in 2001, President Bush put that 30-day window into practice, and then did it again, and then did it again, and got to the point that he needed Executive Order 13233. 13233 limited access for the public to getting Reagan's records and future records as well. The American Library Association was so upset by this, and a number of organizations were, it was very controversial at the time, that they put out a statement. And they, as part of that, they said that EO 13233 effectively denies the public's legitimate right of access to presidential records. They also urged Congress to act to change this and override the executive order. Unfortunately, despite trying, Congress was unable to do so, and they failed to revoke it. So it wasn't until 2009 that President Obama issued Executive Order 13489. It essentially revoked EO 13233. It added some minor language, but for the most part, it just reverted everything back to Reagan's executive order, to that 30-day window rule. And it did add a requirement that the VP keep those records. That's where that comes from. Additionally, later, there was an amendment to the Presidential Records Act and the Federal Records Act, but I'm not going to get into that, that addressed electronic accounts and electronic records. Specifically, it prohibited sending electronic records through non-official accounts. However, there were exceptions. A non-official account can be used if an official account is copied, or if a copy is forwarded to an official account shortly after it's made. So that's the basic piece of the Presidential Records Act. That kind of gives you a good overview of what the requirements of it are. The idea, of course, to archive the records of a presidency. I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking now about President Trump's use of Twitter. Of course, President Trump is not the first to use Twitter. President Obama did with the @POTUS handle and kept his private tweets on his other handle. President Trump has used both interchangeably, but for the most part uses @RealDonaldTrump, which is his private Twitter handle. We're going to talk about the complications that has created, and whether you hate him or love him, there's no doubt that the Trump administration and President Trump is doing things that are completely unprecedented with Twitter, and it does create some specific challenges to the enforcement of the PRA. So we need to start with two major points. The first is, what is an official record, and how can such a record be deleted if we're going to talk about President Trump? So it says here, and this is from the PRA, materials created in the course of conducting activities which relate to or have an effect upon the carrying out, you get the idea. If it's a presidential thing, if it's part of that office or part of that work, then it's an official record, and those materials need to be kept. As far as deletions go, and I mentioned this previously, presidents may dispose of records once the views of the Archivist of the United States on the proposed disposal have been obtained in writing. So let's start with the first one. Let's talk about the officialness of a record. Some of you may remember that there was some controversy when President Trump was blocking other people from his Twitter account. That's a very common thing to do when you have Twitter and somebody's bugging you. In this case, anybody who criticized the president, not anybody, but many people who criticized the president were blocked. The Knight First Amendment Institute sued President Trump over that, and it was ruled in 2018 that President Trump did not have the right to block other Twitter accounts from viewing his feed. It was upheld multiple times in court, and blocking was not something that they could do. Now, Trump's legal team made a decent argument here. They said that the account was operated in a personal capacity and had the right to block critics. The question is, was it operated in a personal capacity, or was the work of the government being done on it? The U.S. Court of Appeals, in their ruling, Judge Parker said, "We are not persuaded. We conclude the evidence of the official nature of the account is overwhelming." Not being a legal scholar, I can't tell you for sure, but I believe that that sets some pretty serious precedent for what is and is not official in how he uses that account. Some of the things that happened, I'll just give you a couple examples of some official business that was done. Without telling anyone, President Trump tweeted that transgender individuals would no longer be allowed to serve in the U.S. military. The U.S. military's response was, well, we're not going to change anything until you give us some actual guidance on this. A tweet's not going to do it for us. But it's a good example of, we're doing this, we're moving forward. That was the announcement. It wasn't something that came from his press secretary first, and then he followed up with on Twitter. It happened on Twitter Live. Another thing that happened that was a big deal was when Rex Tillerson was fired as the director of the CIA. I'm sorry. That was a mistake. When Rex Tillerson was fired. Apologies, let's try that again. When Rex Tillerson was fired as the Secretary of State, this was announced on Twitter. And the Washington Post had just broken the story, and minutes later, Trump tweeted out that Mike Pompeo would become the new Secretary of State. The State Department was not informed of this. Certainly Rex Tillerson was not informed of this. He learned, of course, through the media, and he was officially phoned by the president 3 hours later and told that he had been fired. This is the type of business that President Trump has regularly done in his work on Twitter. This is an official account, and it's being used for those purposes. Now, as far as those deletions go, let's talk for a moment about what is being done. Are these things being tracked? That's the big question mark right now. The NARA, the National Archives and Records Administration, the National Archives, they sent a letter specifically to the Committee on Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs in the Senate in 2017. This was a question that kept coming up. So this is their statement, or part of their statement. NARA has advised the White House that it should capture and preserve all tweets that the president posts in the course of his official duties, including those that are subsequently deleted as presidential records. And NARA has been informed by White House officials that they are, in fact, doing so. Now, whether that's happening or not, we aren't really sure. We know that, well, at least I know in the research that I've done, that we don't have any information from the administration about how they are going about doing this. That was not the case with previous administrations, that they specifically laid out their formats and their archiving methods and all those things. That hasn't happened. So we're just having to take it at their word. And remember, the National Archives will not get these things until after the administration ends. It is the responsibility of the president's administration to track all this information. And they are specifically asking that deleted records need to be kept. So let's take a look at a couple of those deletion and changes examples. Here's just one. For those of you who were down in Alabama, you may remember when President Trump supported Luther Strange during the Senate primary, and he lost. And immediately after he lost, all of the supporting tweets that Trump had done previously were deleted. Another example was Trump was doing official diplomatic correspondence, you could say, with the Prime Minister of the UK, Theresa May. The only issue is that the Theresa May that he tagged was the wrong one. The tweet was deleted and corrected, but it was many hours later that happened. And of course, there are a lot of folks who are concerned, and are not happy just taking the word of the Trump administration that this thing is happening, that these records are being tracked and kept. Two nonprofit watchdog groups failed in their suit to hold the President Trump and his administration responsible, and they believe that they are not keeping those deleted tweets and archiving them as part of the PRA. And I think it's very clear that the PRA requires that. The case is pending appeal, but it doesn't look likely. But we do have another statement. This was one of the only other places that I could find a statement from the White House about what they're doing. The White House said that they work diligently to ensure that all staff comply with the PRA. Now, I can't go too far without talking about some congressional movement here as well. It didn't go very far, but you may be familiar with the Communications over Various Feeds Electronically for Engagement Act, or the COFEFE Act, if you remember President Trump's notorious and mysterious tweet that got us all buzzing back in May 2017. The proposed bill that is just sitting in committee at this point would amend the PRA and would bar a president from deleting social media posts, completely bar them from doing so, and require that those things are preserved. Now, of course, this bill is not likely to go anywhere. It's been in committee for a long time. It's important to remember, though, that future presidents could amend the PRA by executive order. Future congressional things could come forward. We will just have to wait and see. I don't know that, personally, I feel that an amendment is necessary. I believe the PRA is clear. From having looked through it, I believe that even if these tweets are not official government business and are not classified as so, although the National Archives say that they should be, I believe that they have made a historical impact. The way President Trump has used Twitter and the way that the world has reacted to it over the last 4 years is unprecedented. We have a responsibility to capture that information and make sure that it's archived for future historical purposes. I also want to point out this isn't about a single administration. Yes, President Trump is doing this and doing it in a way that is novel and different and challenges the way that we think and approach these types of issues. But it would set a precedent for what the American public has the right to see and know and learn about in the future and to hold in our records. And we have to act to make sure that this happens. Now, we won't know for some time whether or not this is has been followed up with. We will have to watch. And so I wanted to share this presentation with you all because I suspect that the PRA may make the news in the next few months. Anyway, thanks for your time tonight. Have a good night.